Good afternoon. I'm Mary Costello and I'm a Senior Research Manager at the UK Commission for Employment and Skills. We're really delighted today to have Professor Ewart Keep come today to do our latest Masterclass. It's a series of Masterclasses that we organise and plan in conjunction with the Institute of Education's Lakes Research Centre. So this afternoon Ewart is going to be talking about where next for post-19 vocational education and training. So it'll be just about half an hour of Ewart speaking, and then we will have Q&A afterwards. So hopefully have a good debate. Then following that, we'll be having a blog posted about the event as well, so that'll be good for you to look at. We'll send out the links to that afterwards. And so without further ado, over to Ewart. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the UK Commission and Francis for inviting me to do this. In the early 2000s, the then Department for Trade and Industry used to have a very regular series of lunchtime seminars on skills in the labour market, which ran for 4 or 5 years. And in a way, I think the UK Masterclass is a good way of reviving that tradition. Okay, well, what am I going to try and do? Well, I have some aims. I want to reflect and draw upon actually slightly more than 30 years of experience of looking at vocational education and training policy across the UK and the developed world. I want to step back from some of the immediate sort of detail of policy and look at what's going on underneath our policy and some of what I think are the underlying issues. I want to set some challenges for policymakers and practitioners, and actually researchers as well, because I'm going to raise a lot more questions, and I'm going to try and answer those questions today. And I hope I'll provide some entertainment for those of you who've got strong nerves. If by the end of this I haven't said something which has slightly disturbed every single one of you, then I haven't done my job properly. I really mean that. Okay, I have a structure. I'm going to look at current, what I think are potential clashes of what policy vision and model underlie vocational education and training policy in England. I've got 9 very quick sort of middle level challenges, and then I've got a meta level challenge, which is actually what is policy for in the future. So I have a structure. Let's start with competing visions. Well, if we scroll back to the late lamented coalition, the coalition's model was higher vocational education, a new, in inverted commas, role for further education. As laid out in BIS's dual mandate consultation paper, which came out just before the election kicked in. Not that it matters now, but Labour had the opposite vision. They rearranged the initials in the acronym. They were into vocational higher education, and what they wanted were more technical degrees. And for anyone who's read it, Liam Robbins rebooted his model for a new expansion of sub-degree and degree level higher education, mainly delivered through universities rather than FE. There's a huge underlying set of competing tensions around market versus system and whether you can combine the two. And I'll come back to that because I think it's very, very important. Other parts of the UK, Wales and Scotland, are certainly tending to go down the system route rather than going down the market route. For good or ill, they've made a very clear choice about how they want to manage their vocational education and training. They want to manage it as a system, not as a marketplace. Now, final one, which we'll sort of then scroll into the next slide, is that, at least before the election, and it'll be interesting to see how this one develops, BIS and DFE, I do think, have got slightly incommensurable visions for post-19 vocational education and training. I'll come back to that in a second. But I think the key thing is that although these things are presented very often by policymakers themselves as either or, actually the way policy happens to usually roll out in England is it's actually a bit of and. So you get a bit of market and you get a bit of system. Well, that doesn't always work terribly well. I suspect that if BIS and DFE can't come to an agreement, and they probably won't, about the future of post-18-19 vet, then we will get a bit of and it will be interesting to see whose bit tends to be the bigger bit. Okay, BIS's dual mandate paper had a very different bit in the post-18 box. First of all, BIS and DFE don't appear to agree when educators, the compulsory phase ends, or at least the phase that they're in, each of them is in control of. So DFE like the idea that after 18 it's a different world, whereas actually most of the sort of official rubric is actually post-19, but there we go. But notice what's in that box. I mean, it's a simple binary choice. You notice you don't go to higher education. A lot of higher education is delivered in FE. You go to university, or apparently at some point in the future you go on an apprenticeship. The whole of post-18-19 FE apparently disappears. Now that's a really interesting model because it doesn't bear much relationship to the current reality of student flows. And I'm going to suggest in a minute that it really raises some quite big challenges if people genuinely believe that that is the underlying direction of travel for policy. I don't think it's going to be very easy to do that. So there is a bit of a tension between the BIS's dual mandate paper and that DFE model of the future policy universe. This is also being enacted in a system, whether it is a system or a marketplace, we're not clear at this point, that has limited, I mean perhaps no coordination is a bit cruel, but limited coordination, plan or common architecture. And again, I'll come back in a minute to why I think there's an underlying problem, but just looking at the streams of provision, you've got schools which are now becoming increasingly varied. And they are plainly moving away from a local model to a semi-nationalised model in the sense that as more and more schools become UTCs, free schools or academy or studio schools, their essential contract is with the Secretary of State rather than with any local control, which is interesting in a world where we're now talking about city deals and localising the education and skills system. Again, I'll come back to that one. But you've got lots of different strands of activity. You've got schools, which, as I say, is no longer a particularly coherent category. You've got 14 to 19 FE with its own completely separate funding system, 19 to 24 FE with its own completely separate funding system. You've got 24 plus FE, you've got community learning, you've got apprenticeship, you've got HE, and if you wanted to add in anything more, you've got all of the DWP skills-based bits of the work programme. So if you're trying to manage this, particularly if you're a manager in an FE college, you've got an amazingly complex set of funding streams to try and juggle. And if those funding streams exist within some kind of overall master plan, it's not ultimately clear to the people on the ground what that master plan might be. You've also, I think, got a very, very fragmented governance structure. I'm not entirely sure that the different bits of BIS, FE and skills, HE, innovation, employment, always talk to one another as much as they might. But it's play. You've got an awful lot of players in this field, some of which have been given incredibly specialised roles. I have enormous difficulty in explaining to overseas practitioners and academics what Ofqual does. The idea of having a market regulator as the sole national body for your qualification system is a real puzzle to practically everyone else in the OECD. It's an almost completely unique model. But you've got lots and lots and lots and lots of players, okay? Some of which are immensely powerful, quite hefty. You've also got a whole series of issues about how you represent employers in the structure. Sector skills councils, come back to that, seem to be on the wane. Everyone seems very keen on one-off volunteer groupings of employers to do certain sorts of things, but that does raise big issues about what happens when those one-off groupings disband. And actually how you consult the vast bulk of employers who may not be quite as keen on life as the trailblazers and their volunteer groups. You've got LEPs, you've got city deals, you've got localism. Now, I think that's not necessarily an easy landscape to produce concerted policy in. I also think there are real problems about the fact that people who are charged with fiddling around with one bit of the system, as tends to be the way we do policy in England, will affect other bits. So some people will be working on future staffing of the system, some people are working on curriculum, some people are working on assessment, some people are working on pedagogy. We may fiddle around with where the site of learning is, which has huge implications for all of those, and funding, and learning entitlement. So there is a real difficulty that very often, at least in the past, we've changed one element of the system and then been quite surprised when other bits of it change as a consequence, usually unforeseen. It's a system. whether you want to use it as a market or not, there's still, if you like, a systems architecture to the way that the different components interact, and therefore change is much harder to manage than policymakers have sometimes thought. Now, at the moment, we have all of those things going on in the qualification space. And it's not tremendously clear to me, sitting on an off-qual vocational subcommittee, that all of this necessarily adds up to a tremendously coherent package of reforms. I wonder how all of these things will align when the dust settles in 3 or 4 years. I also think the following quote, which was in an FE Week supplement, is actually a really rather important one. There has been a tendency, particularly around qualification reform, to see that as a lever for changing all sorts of other things like the curriculum or entitlement or even pedagogy. And I really wonder if trying to change qualifications is the best way to go about it. And there are people sitting in this audience, like Alison Fuller, who've made this point many times before, that we tend to reach for qualification reform as a sort of shortcut to changing other things. It's not clear that's terribly effective. And I do think that the way in which we endlessly change, particularly our vocational qualification system, does have unpleasant side effects and drawbacks. Now, given all those competing visions and what I think it would be fair to say is structural complexity, what are some of the big challenges? Okay, well, we've got 9 what I call middle level challenges. Then we've got one enormous one, which is what the hell is policy for in future? Okay, the BIS paper, dual mandate, basically seem to believe that level 2 further education post-19 would just quietly vanish. And everything would gradually become either second chance lifelong learning for the really deprived, or, much more importantly, if one reads the paper, really about level 3 and above higher level vocational and technical skills. Now that's lovely, but there is a huge amount of level 2 further education which is not being provided just for fun. It actually meets genuine employer need and actually individual need within large swathes of our service economy. And that need for training at that level, at level 2 and below, is not going to vanish anytime soon. So if people really believe that post-19 FE colleges will simply have a nice, neat dual mandate, I can't see that happening in what's left of my working lifetime, which is about 10 years. And I actually think working towards that goal, beautifully clear though it is going to be extremely problematic. Plainly, there's a huge problem with the way in which politicians of all parties, who in the election campaign loaded insane expectations onto the apprenticeship system. Apprenticeships are not the answer to everything, and there have been some really cogent articles by NIACE, by Alison Wolfe, about the problems of trying to use apprenticeship as a solval. It's not possible for it to do that. There are whole rafts of provision which you won't easily cover. And actually, even if you look at countries which have expansive, large, high-quality apprenticeship systems like Germany, quite a lot of actual provision is still done in specialist colleges. It's not actually all done through apprenticeship. But we've now got the 3 million manifesto pledge, which we have to deliver. Well, actually, you have to deliver it. I don't have to, which is good. But notice this little bit. That the manifesto pledged it continuing to replace lower level, I suspect those dreadful level 2 classroom-based FE courses with high-quality apprenticeship. Well, that's absolutely dependent on employers being willing to deliver on that. If they don't, the target is completely redundant. Actually, it's not the government who will decide whether that target gets met. It's not anyone in this room. It's employers, individual employers. And just to remind you, now, there are lots of different, everyone publishes different rankings of the top 10 apprenticeship frameworks. This one came from a breakdown from FE Week. Some of them actually get engineering in somewhere down at the bottom, but notice most of those, they're in the service sector, a lot of them at level 2. The future of apprenticeships is they're supposed to be an occupationally based apprenticeship. Well, customer service is not an occupation. And I honestly and genuinely have no idea what a level 2 in improving operational performance is. But whatever it is, no one else in Europe would recognise that as the title for an apprenticeship. Again, coming back to work that Alison and Lorna Unwin have done about our weak conception of occupation. I'd also just flag up that at 5, we have management at level 2. Now, again, I would really like to know what's in that box. Level 2 management for apprenticeship? Very strange. So you'll notice that if the dual mandate paper is to be taken seriously, what's missing are higher level technician skills. They're not really in there in those top 10. Now, as I say, there are some top 10s, if you do the ranking slightly differently, where engineering will creep in at 9 or 10. But above and beyond that, the rankings tend to produce that kind of picture of what employers are willing to pay for and provide places for. So that suggests the dual mandate model may have quite a long way to go. I don't want to labour this point, but the dual mandate paper has got a lot to say about trying to reinvigorate higher level vocational learning in further education, which I think is a really laudable goal. But I think its reflection on history is a bit weak. I think mass higher education has sucked the oxygen out of that marketplace with things like foundation degrees. I'd be willing to bet that 10 years from now, the national colleges, once they're set up, will be trying to convert themselves into universities. I just guarantee that's the way the market works. There's a huge problem, which I don't have time to go into, about where you're going to actually find the suitably qualified feedstock of people with a prior level 3 to fill all these additional higher level vocational places. Because at the moment, practically everyone who becomes capable of entering higher education with appropriate qualifications does. So we're going to have to expand our achievement levels at level 3 in order to feed the sub-degree and degree level higher vocational learning that's supposed to be taking place. And of course, the question that the dual mandate paper leaves hanging is who pays for it and how? Employers, well, we've currently got a looming technician crisis, but hey, why? Well, for 25 years plus, lots of large firms in Britain took a training holiday. They didn't train any technicians. They're now, all their existing technicians are getting old, and they're crying, oh, it's terrible. The education system must make good our failure to train anyone. That's a problem. That's a topic for another whole paper. Where is employer ownership leading, and to what is it leading? That's not enormously clear. I'm still not clear what the rights, roles and responsibilities of employers in the system are. And every time we've tried to do that, National Skills Task Force, the Leach Review, government has subsequently backed off from sticking to the bargain about what employers are meant to be paying for and doing. And I suspect that in the financial crunch that's coming, the moment when we actually have to have a hard conversation with employers is about to arrive. Because, in a sense, the arrival of Charlie Mayfield and his inconvenient truth that employers would have to spend more and invest more in skills was actually a very convenient truth for the government, because basically they were cutting back on spending and they knew they were going to keep on doing that. I just want to flag up that underlying that rhetoric about employers having to spend and invest more, the reality is that employers have been cutting back quite hard. The fact that the volume of training days across the UK has fallen by as much as half is not good news. Certainly not for where policy is meant to be going. And again, employer investment is forward. So trying to get employer investment up is going to be an interesting task. It's also clear that we do have problems about structural demand. The OECD's Adult Skills Survey made that very plain, and it replicated earlier data that Francis Green had analysed, which showed very plainly that we've got major problems about levels of demand for post-compulsory schooling in large swathes of our labour market. And I think that we are going to struggle on that one until employers change their ideas about what it is they're willing to recruit. Also, it's not clear to me that employers as a group are necessarily changing their vision of apprenticeship and making it good. Now, I do find that rather depressing, that the government itself tried to create a level 3 apprenticeship where the HMRC said, no, we don't need to give our apprentices any ICT skills because they're not relevant. I'm sorry, they're relevant to every citizen in the modern labour market and world we live in. So the idea that somehow you can take them out of an apprenticeship because they're just a side issue or not relevant is bizarre. Apprenticeships are not training to do an immediate job. They're meant to be training for a broadly conceived occupation, and also to support citizenship in most European countries. We see that as important. So we have a very narrow model, and again, shifting that is going to be hard work. It'll be interesting to see how the new National Occupational Standards and all of the apprenticeship frameworks manage to do that. We also have huge problems with skill utilisation. Those of you who know me would know that I was going to say that, because I always do. But I do think, again, that the OECD's PIAC survey adult skills suggested we do have a problem about mismatch. And employers, when asked by the UK Commission, have also said that even they perceive that they have a problem. So I do think that's another ongoing bit of the difficulty. For employer ownership to work, you need to know how to stimulate employer demand, encourage them to contribute more, and enable them to use the skills to better effect. So skills policy is going to have to gradually move beyond a simple focus on publicly funded skills supply, which over the last 30 years has basically been where most of the policy has been at. And increasingly, it's just not going to work. You're going to have to help employers to do more for themselves. I mean, the old model relied on lots and lots of external support through train to gain, apprenticeship through private training providers. We need to boost workplace learning. We need to do that. Without that, apprenticeship reforms will fail. So what's the current state of the company's own human resource development training function? Well, the simple answer is no one knows. Okay, enough of employers. Market or system? The dual mandate paper, if you analyse it on a sort of textual basis, is a slightly confused document in that it literally flips from using the word market to the word system in subsequent sentences. Now, I think that is problematic. And Hodgson and Ken Spores argued that under New Labour there was a sort of double shuffle. That under New Labour the shuffle was 2 steps towards targets and planning and then 1 step back towards markets. You could argue under the coalition it was 2 steps towards market and 1 step back towards some kind of central direction or control. Where are we heading in future? I don't know the answer to that. It's not at all clear to me that anyone else does that. As yet, though it will, so at some point someone's going to have to make a choice. Market or system? Dual mandate paper says that BIS want to attract new entrants into the FE market all the time. But that actually requires spare capacity to deliver competition. It's very expensive. I do not believe, from talking to City Deals and LEPs, that is the model they've got in their heads. They want to manage their local vet system. They have no interest in attracting new entrants and having a little mini marketplace, because they can't afford it. What they want is to manage and plan their system and to restructure local delivery allocation in a way that makes some kind of rational system choice. So I suspect that if the government decides it really does want to do the market and competition bit, it is going to bump up against City Deals saying, no, that's not the model. You've devolved this stuff to us. Push off. We're going to do it our way, and our way is a system. So I do think there's a temptation to think that localism at the moment is the new black. I mean, everyone's saying, oh, localism, it will answer all our problems. But I have to ask, when it comes to skills, what is being devolved? Funding. Well, there ain't going to be much in the post-19 box after the July budget and the autumn spending statement, I suspect, except for apprenticeships. So what you may be devolving is responsibility, not many resources. But within the context of national qualifications, inspection and programme design regimes, and with a school system almost completely divorced from everything else, because it won't be accountable at a local level. So that again is a bit of a tension. Now, can city regions do it better? I mean, they all believe they can, better than it's been done in the past. But it does seem to me that actually comes with some big requirements. Design capacity for policy that goes beyond a new set of targets. Because otherwise it is just the old policy, but to micro level. I mean, you could argue that a lot of the city deals at the moment seem to be recreating a sort of new Labour model of what skills policy was like, but just at a city-state level. Localised LMI, you can't do anything without that. Delivery capacity to join up business support, otherwise a lot of this won't work. Incentives to power the vision, I don't know where those are going to come from, that's quite problematic. ability to secure real buy-in from employers and other stakeholders. That may be more possible at a local level than it is at a national level, given the weakness of our national employer institutions. I found this wonderful. The title of this, it was originally just the head of maths and English at BIS, which sounded rather like a school, so some sort of post in a school. It has now changed to policy. But I've tried again explaining this to Europeans, and they just scratch their heads. Why would a civil servant be doing this? Well, because QCA no longer exists, Skills Funding Agency does what it does, it says on the tin, it funds things. There is no body to actually deliver these kinds of changes, so BIS has to do it for themselves. Now you compare that with the Skills Funding Agency with the Scottish Funding Council, and you realise that there's a significant lack of strategic capacity within the subordinate agencies, very different from Scotland, and bizarre in a system or marketplace the size of England's. UK Commission is almost the last person standing outside government in terms of an independent research and thinking capacity. Possibly a bit controversial, but I did, again, in my textual analysis of dual mandate paper, note that BIS plainly were trying to signal that they weren't happy with some people. They're plainly not happy with sector skills councils. There's plainly a belief that direct engagement with groups of volunteer employers is a better way to go. But as I've suggested, I think there's a problem with talking to a club of converts, and I don't see where the institutional continuity comes. Ofsted didn't seem to be loved in the dual mandate paper. I think that may have something to do with the Chief Inspector saying late last year that he thought BIS had no skills strategy. And the Skills Funding Agency is almost invisible in the document. It's like it doesn't exist. Now that may be because its role simply is to do formula funding. But again, I come back to the fact that that means that everything else has to be done directly by central government. Funding, well, the biggest immediate problem is funding is falling off a cliff for everything except apprenticeship. Dual mandate paper acknowledges that problem, but it then just goes quiet. It doesn't suggest any solutions. I suspect there is a solution waiting in the wings. It's called loans for everything. That would be the subject of another talk in terms of whether I think it's the answer to everything or anything. I would flag up that you need to think a lot harder in the medium to long term about new models for institutional co-investment. And by co-investment, I don't just mean government and employers, I mean employers and workers, which is oddly enough what happens in most of the rest of Europe. Finally, I get to my meta-level, existential crisis slide. It's a crisis for you, not for me. Skills policy up to now has been almost exclusively, really, at a sort of the top level, the headline policy issue, has been moving us up the international league tables. Leaks review, everything else. It's always been at the back of people's minds. How are we doing in PISA? How are we doing in PIAC? And the solution has been publicly funded attempts to expand further in higher education, change schooling, but it's been driven by public money and largely by them rather than by employers. Well, the money that drove that policy model is running out. What are going to be the new goals for policy? Could they be market design, market regulation, correcting market failure? Does the government just step back ultimately? A new model for integrated business support might be another way to go, though I suspect it won't be the way that actually occurs, but you could argue that this is exactly what's emerging in Scotland under the Scottish Government, Scottish Funding Council, Skills Development Scotland. You can see Wales beginning to inch its way towards this kind of model. And I think that at least as a response to the productivity crisis we have, this model may gain some traction, at least in the devolved administrations. Finally, I think there are some really fundamental long-term choices, not just affecting skills policy, because ultimately skills policy is subordinate on other considerations and issues. How many of our firms are going to take the high road as opposed to the low road in terms of competitive strategies and the employment, wages, conditions that they offer their staff? Well, UK Commission and quite a lot of academics would argue that too many firms have taken the low road. Some of them are path dependent, and that if you look at the current trends of structural growth within our employment and labour market, you wouldn't necessarily believe that all was well with the world, particularly at the bottom end of the labour market, particularly amongst large service sector firms, and particularly when you look at the productivity figures, which ought to be ringing louder alarm bells than they are. I think the old model has run out because it simply cannot be afforded. BIS is not going to be able to spend its way towards internationally benchmarked targets. The only target it's going to have money to spend its way towards is apprenticeship, and even that's reliant on greater employer contribution. So I think the clock is ticking. I'd argue that we've wasted the last quarter of a century chasing a skills supply-led dream. Where do we go next? Oh, and look, I've kept to time, so there we are. And now you can ask me all those questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I've got lots of questions in my head, and so I'm hoping some of you here have got some of those questions to give to it now. So, any questions?
Hi, at one of your slides you said that we had the second highest level of qualification in the OECD, I think after Japan.
Yep.
At what level are we saying that we've got too many, say, academically at level 6, 7? Is that where the overqualification is?
It's at all levels.
At all levels?
It's also, I mean, it's particularly actually, there's quite a significant overqualification at the very bottom of the labour market. We have fewer people with no qualifications than jobs that appear to require no qualifications, or very few qualifications. So it's right across the spectrum. There's quite a substantial mismatch, bizarrely, at level 3, which is really concerning given you know, the fact that we don't do particularly well at level 3 to start with. The interesting trend, I mean, there are different sources for this data. So the OECD doesn't really break it down by level, at least not in the tables I've looked at. I suspect there are other tables that probably do. But work by Francis Green and others suggests that the one area where the mismatch may have reduced a little bit in recent years is graduates. Actually, the graduate mismatch has declined, but at other levels it's still very high.
So I mean, we do have a skills gap at 4 or 5, but so how does the qualification?
Well, we have a looming gap in terms of there is going to be huge replacement demand as large rafts of sort of more skilled technicians retire. And that will create a huge challenge for the further and or higher education system, depending on how we choose to meet it. But it is, and that's going to be a really big sort of crunch in terms of supply. But otherwise, I think we've got a real danger that we are likely to ramp up the level of supply in large rafts of the population in terms of the qualifications they hold and the skills that their jobs require. And I think the really scary bit is the growth of relatively low skilled, low paid productivity work in large swathes across the bottom end of the labour market. I mean, it's a huge drag on our productivity. And we're not using the skills that we the taxpayers spent an awful lot of money giving these people.
I just want to ask, in terms of the high road versus low road, what kind of interventions would you see being top of the list of policy there in trying to move businesses into that high road approach?
It's really difficult. And the Scots have been grappling with this longer and harder because they woke up to the fact that they'd spent an awful lot of money on particularly expanding higher education, and it wasn't showing much feed through to their productivity figures. You need, I think, very tailored business support, business development interventions. You need to try and get sectors and groups of employers in those sectors to actually think more ambitiously about how their sector might proceed. And you could argue that in England, the strategic industrial partnerships are a starting point. Now they cover probably too small a proportion of the economy and labour market. I think also you need sort of macro policy settings that are pushing employers as hard as you can, though it's difficult, away from creating low-wage jobs that require tax credits to, in a sense, top them up. You need to get employers, I mean, a lot of employers have learned to live with low pay, low productivity, and they don't necessarily see it as a huge problem. And perhaps for them it isn't, But it's an enormous problem for our economy, it's an enormous problem for our labour market, it's an enormous problem for the people who do these low-paid jobs in a lot of instances, and it is not a future towards which we ought to be heading. But the kinds of interventions that are needed are difficult, and I think this is one of the problems that a relatively small LEP is grappling with. What are the levers that if I was running a LEP, have got to pull in order to start influencing these things? And I do fear that it does require an overarching framework of policy at government level. Plainly, with the current government, I won't be holding my breath.
Thanks, Ewart. I thought that was really, really great, by the way, so
Thank you.
very stimulating. I just wondered, you talk about FE, and I just wondered whether you thought about the implications for different parts of the provider landscape. So are you talking about FE colleges? Are there different implications for private training providers?
Oh, yeah.
And so on. So I think it'd be useful to learn a bit more about that.
Okay. FE colleges are already grappling with a massively changing funding system and set of incentives. The 24% cut earlier this year has really concentrated minds, and a lot of minds were already fairly concentrated on what is the future of post-19 provision in a lot of colleges. A lot of colleges are going to be withdrawing from large swathes of the market, and that's a problem, particularly in rural areas where you may actually not be able, to find whole particular courses for smaller scale, smaller volume specialist skills. In the southwest of England, I can see in 4 or 5 years' time there will be a lot of people who want to study things, and there won't be any provision because colleges will have withdrawn from it, unless we can find mechanisms for getting colleges to reapportion different specialisms between them, so that you do, and that suggests that the system might be the way to go, at least regionalise, some kind of regionalised trading structure. Private training providers, I suspect are feeling relatively happy because their main business with government is either DWP stuff or it's apprenticeship, and on apprenticeship they've already to some extent seen off the original proposals for direct funding through employers on apprenticeship. I suspect they recognise that if there is going to be money around, it's going to go to apprenticeship and therefore to them. My problem with private training providers in England, and they're very different in England, by the way, from the way in which they behave collectively in Scotland and Wales. They're much smaller, cuddlier creatures in Scotland and Wales. They have teeth here, and my problem is that I actually think what we have currently is not an employer-led training system. We have a private training provider-led training system with all the unfortunate consequences. The problem is that we spent the last 30 years erecting that system, and moving away from it is going to be exceedingly painful. But if we don't move away from it, if we do not genuinely put more of the onus and decision-making and training requirements on employers individually and collectively, then we are, I suspect, not going to make much progress. But the funding, we don't know what the funding settlement is going to be for the vocational education and training post-19, but I wouldn't imagine it's going to be terribly good. So I do think that if you're running an FE college, the world is going to be a very tough place, and there are going to be some very tough choices to be made.
Thank you for that talk. It was very interesting. Coming back to the mismatch of the overqualification across all levels, and also you mentioned that there was perhaps limited demand for level 3 and above in the UK. So that sounded like on one level we seem to have lots of well-skilled people and there's limited demand. Would you say that the overqualification is too many people with wrong sorts of skills? The reason for asking this question is I work with the life science sector, pharmaceuticals, medical technologies, and there's a huge skill shortages, particularly in areas high-level technicians, manufacturing technicians, and the like, and STEM more generally. So is it sort of qualified people with wrong sort of skills, or what would you see causing that?
Well, I mean, some of it certainly is that. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that a lot of people acquire qualifications that are probably of limited value to them or actually to the labour market. And one of the reasons for that is our long-running problem with information, advice and guidance. And until we crack that, we'll carry on having that problem. And obviously, decisions made by the previous administration on information, advice and guidance for people in school were probably not a great step forward. We do have a problem with that. And again, I would urge you to look at what the Scots are doing. They have managed to do a lot better on information, advice and guidance for all ages, and I think are making a much better job of the whole area. But I think there is a problem around STEM in the sense that, yes, we have got a looming crisis, but the responsibility for that crisis, to some extent at least, rests with employers who stopped in the early 1980s training technicians. They just basically stopped doing it, and they started to rely upon graduates who were coming out of university free. And as a member of the Scottish Funding Council Skills Committee, I'll tell you a little tiny story, because it's one of those things that just sort of exemplifies that there's nothing good about this story. Everything about it is wrong. Life science companies in Scotland said, we can't get good lab technicians. The graduates we're recruiting don't actually have the lab skills we need. That was wrong in the sense that the universities had, when we investigated, massively cut back on the amount of lab time that the kids were doing. That's wrong. If you're going to do a life science degree, you need to learn to be a practical scientist. But the other thing that was wrong was that rather than train their own technicians and help pay for it, the employers were simply relying on the public purse to actually pay for lots of degrees. And the really bizarre thing was we landed up on the Funding Council to sort this crisis out in the short term. We landed up putting on a new course in a FE college to retrain already graduated life science graduates with the lab skills they needed to become lab technicians, which is not really what graduates should be doing in the first place. So there is a terrible, terrible tendency for our system to create perverse incentives which actually drive investment decisions that are not, in the long term, not particularly good ways to go. And I do think on the technician crisis, some of the responsibility will inevitably have to fall upon employers. But I suspect they'll be deeply resistant because they'll just say, no, expand graduate provision because we don't have to pay for that.
I'm referring to Tom. I disagree about the problem of over-qualification because of the high returns to higher education, graduate education, that hasn't fallen. So the only way that can be the case is because there's a demand and the demand outstrips the increased supply. So therefore, I find it very hard to believe that there's such a thing properly as overqualification. I can see how people can take time in the labour market to get into a job that matches their skills, and people do move jobs, so the mismatch becomes perhaps less as people get older. But overqualification seems to me not such a big deal.
Francis Green was here. He would challenge you on that because he's done a lot of work on rates of return to graduates. The problem is the average. Yes, the average has not fallen. The problem is that for those graduates who are at the bottom end of the earnings curve, in a sense, not only has the premium vanished, but in actual fact there are now negative penalties for some. So the problem is that the average is dragged up by the very high earners to a certain extent. And when you look at the 50% who are below the line, quite a lot of them are a long way below the average return. And the figures we've got currently would suggest, London Economics did this, 2 years ago, there are now, you can very clearly see patterns of particular subjects in particular institutions, particular sorts of students that show zero rate of return. And again, if the demand is rising, one would have thought that the way the RAB charge keeps on going up because of the endless recalculation of the proportion of students who never fully repay their loan suggests that there is a problem. So my problem is I just find average rates of return deeply misleading. What I want to see is the distribution around that average. And I think when you look at graduates, there's some quite scary figures out there in terms of what large chunks of the graduate population are doing and earning and are likely to carry on earning for a large chunk of their career.
I don't quite understand the concept of skills shortages and why the market doesn't respond to them. And I wonder if there's a strong signal from government that if you get in a mess and you can't fill technician vacancies, you solve it.
Yeah.
That work.
Yeah, I do think that we've socialised employers, or policy, particularly in England, has socialised employers into a sort of welfare-dependent mode. I mean, I think welfare dependency is a much more general problem, and I think on skills, employers have become state-dependent. They have always assumed that if they shout loud enough, the government of the day will expand further or higher education at the general taxpayer's expense or at the expense of the student through a student loan system. Employers have not contributed much, and it's very interesting in Scotland, where the Scottish government has put in place things called Sectoral Skills Investment Plan, SIPs, and Scottish Funding Council and Skills Development Scotland Skills Committee jointly administer these. I sit on the committee, and one of the fascinating things is watching employers come to the committee and say, look, we've got this plan and we want you to invest X, government, state. And we say, yes, but what are you going to invest? And they say, well, we can't afford to. We can't afford to pay for training. The taxpayer has to pay for it. And the response in Scotland has been to push back the employers on that and say, no, sorry, you've actually got to factor in doing certain sorts of training for your own workforce. You cannot assume that the state is going to do it for you. But obviously, moving from a situation where employers have been able to pull this trick to moving to a world where they're more self-reliant is really, really difficult, because you're not just facing employers, who plainly a lot of which are sitting there thinking, I don't want to pay more money, but also around apprenticeship and some other forms of training, the private training providers are very happy with the current system, because state money is to a certain extent more certain and easy for them, and they quite like it. So it's a long-term project, but it's going to have to happen, because in a sense the state is going to have fewer options in terms of what it can spend, except perhaps through a loan system for more FE.
In a system where average HE lasts 3 years and apprenticeship lasts a minimum of 1 year, where do skills that require shorter training sit in the future, shorter courses?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, one of the things that we've been peculiarly bad at, and I think in that sense it's one of the things the dual mandate paper does get right, is this problem that we have tended to flip between apprenticeship, usually at quite a low level, and then, if it can't be done that way, then it has to be done through a degree. And the history of foundation degrees is not a particularly happy one, and it seems to me it has some warnings. Again, although it's not perfect in Scotland by any means, but I think the Scots were quite canny. They didn't abolish HNCs and HNDs, and because they've always had articulation agreements between colleges and their local university, or most of their local universities, they've been able to keep up a sub-degree route that's bigger and more vibrant than the one that we have in England. I think there is a real sort of gap at sort of level 3.5 to 4 in terms of advanced craft people and technician, and I suspect that the best way to deliver that, both pedagogically and financially, is through a mixture of further education and learning on the job work experience, which may or may not be a formal apprenticeship. But it seems to me that without that model, what you will inevitably see is a drift into, yes, we'll set up another degree course somewhere or other. And some of the degree courses, I'm not saying they're bad courses, but in any other country they would be done through some kind of apprenticeship with a college-based element. So floristry, 3 years honours degree in floristry. Equine management, how to run a riding stables. It's not clear to me that those are necessarily best or most efficiently catered for through higher education, but they are, to some extent.
I just wanted to go back to what you were saying about employer investment, because I think that's really interesting, and thank you for everything so far. I wondered if you had any insights from other countries where they've been more successful at engaging in employer investment, perhaps from the situation we're in now, where you've got the socialisation of employers towards state dependency. How do we do it?
Yeah.
How, can we learn from others about what can we do to re-engage employer investment in this skill set?
Okay. I mean, the quick answer is there are no easy answers. I mean, if I had an easy answer, I'd sell it to the government and then retire on the proceeds. Great. Unfortunately, I don't have that, so I'm going to have to labour on. It seems to me that there are things that can be done, but they're difficult. I mean, it's very difficult to move from where we are to where a lot of European countries are. I mean, they've had co-investment through sectoral level collective bargaining, where employers and employees have committed at the wage bargaining round to put certain amounts of money aside to fund adult training in that sector. Not just job-specific training, but more general training. Now, the results of those funds are mixed, but at least they exist. Employers in a lot of countries have always assumed that they would have to contribute more to the cost of apprenticeship and that they were more responsible for apprenticeship than our employers have been. And that, I think, is going to be the big struggle this government faces around its 3 million target. It's getting employers to actually accept that they have to do more, and they probably have to pay more, which they really won't like doing. But I think there are things that can be done, and I offer 2 suggestions. One is co-investment funds at the level of the individual organisation are possible, and interestingly, I think it was DTI sponsored some early tests in the sort of early to mid 2000s, which were done through Union Learn, and Southwest TUC has carried on trying these little pilots, and they do seem to have some success in terms of getting employers and employees to create firm level funds to fund things that otherwise couldn't be funded. And if you give me your card or your email address, I'll email you the 2 reports, because I actually genuinely think that there's a huge opportunity there which would be cost free to government and could be very, very powerful in the long term. The other thing that I think is good is what the Scots have done. And I'm not Scottish, by the way, so when I say Scots, I'm doing things better. It's not because I'm Scottish or I hold any brief for Scotland, except that I go there and work for the Scottish government and officials a lot. And I think actually this is replicable. Wales is already doing it around regional skills agreements. Scots do it through regional skills agreements and through sector skills agreements. Is providing a mechanism rather like the old, for those of you who can remember it, sector skills agreements, but it seems to be able to we seem better able to make them stick in Wales and Scotland, in terms of using forecasting and planning mechanisms to say, okay, you employers say you need X. We, the state, are willing to pay for Y. What are you willing to do? Where's your Z? And it's actually a mechanism for forcing employers to confront the fact that they've got to do things for themselves, either individually or as a sector, and they've got to think about how they contribute. So basically, it's a psychological reprogramming tool. And I actually think that over time, it is beginning to shift employers' perceptions of what they have to do. But of course, it only works if the state and its agencies fold their arms when employers say, we're not going to do anything. Because that's the stage at which then in Scotland, the state then says, right, if you're not going to do anything, we're not. We won't sign this sectoral skills investment plan off until you put some offers on the table in terms of what you're going to do.
Thank you.
I was going to ask about co-investment models, but I think you covered that off in the previous answer. So.
Okay. I'm just wondering, Professor Keep, actually, what the role of qualifications going forward is. We've talked a little bit about the dearth of offer at the sub-degree level, and of course HNCs and HNDs don't allow an open market because they're kind of monopolised by one particular awarding organisation. What about the role of qualifications? Government, or the last government, certainly didn't seem to like them within the context of an apprenticeship model, but what about qualifications going forward?
Well, I think there are limited things you can do with qualifications. We've plainly got a situation in which we've got a regulated market, and above and beyond that, as long as the qualifications are valid, whatever that means, huge technical argument I'm not even going to try to get into, then basically it's up to the marketplace to decide. Though of course it isn't, because at the same time the government is plainly, DFE is busy rationalising huge rafts of qualifications. So the market to a certain extent, yet again, tends to turn out to be something of an illusion. It's market and medal. I think that the problem that history the answer that history would give you is we have used qualification reform for purposes and functions that it is not capable of delivering. We actually use it as displacement activity. We think that if we change the qualification, we will change the pedagogy, we will change the curriculum. And one of the problems is our instability. I mean, if you want to get foreign academics or policymakers to giggle nervously, try explaining our qualification reforms over the last 20 years. They just laugh. I mean, after a while, they just look at you in complete disbelief and say, you've got to be joking. You can't keep changing your vocational qualifications, particularly the general ones, but now the occupationally specific. You can't keep doing this and expect employers, young people, parents, all the people who have to deliver them to understand them or do them properly. I think that's true. If we're going to, if the current round of reform does not represent a settled settlement for the next 15 years, then in my judgment it fails completely. We've got to stop tinkering. The current reforms have got to be made to work, not very easy, but once we've finished with them, We need to stop tinkering, which obviously ministers just do not want to hear. They love to play.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Okay.
Would you agree that when you talk about the concept of employers, that it's important not to kind of homogenise the concept? Because thinking about the large employer, for example, there are examples where a technician engineering qualification might cost an employer in real terms, say £97,000. So the amount of funding, if there is any funding around, is actually quite small in the proportion. Of course, we are a family, we have lots of SMEs, and that's different. But there is a danger when we talk about employers that we're just kind of grouping everybody into one great kind of amorphous whole.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a problem that I've written about. It really worries me. I mean, we talk about employers blandly, but it's plainly size of firm, sector, product market strategy, dominant technology, employment model that the firm has got. All of these will massively impact on what they've got. It's plain to me that one of the reasons why certain sorts of employers, particularly in engineering and construction, will expend significant amounts of money on apprenticeship is because it is the only way that they can create certain sorts of skills. They cannot be created anywhere else. So in a sense, they are locked into a path-dependent model. The massive problems we're going to face with apprenticeship policy in the next 4 or 5 years is going to be those huge swathes of the bottom-end service sector, the level 2. I'm having this training for free from a private training provider. It's not really an apprenticeship in my mind because I don't know what an apprenticeship is, and I'm certainly not contributing a third of the costs up front as the government would like me to. Those are the employers who unfortunately provide huge, really significant apprenticeship volume, who I suspect are going to go walkabouts when the reforms start to roll out. And that does worry me because the 3 million target is going to be extremely difficult to reach, even if everything goes smoothly. And I would be willing to make a fair-sized bet that things will not go smoothly, and a lot of service sector employers see that the new apprenticeship is costly, demanding, and actually means they have to do something rather than just receive a free assessment service from a private training provider. That's going to be a real culture shock, and wait for the squeals.
I think that's an excellent point to close now. Thank you very much to Ewart for a very interesting and thought-provoking discussion there. We'll have the video of this online later, and we'll send you links to that. Also, as I say, we're having a blog, and we'll also hopefully have the slides as well to distribute to you. So there'll be more coming, along with details of our forthcoming masterclasses. So thank you very much again for coming. And if you could complete your feedback sheets, that'll help us develop further sessions in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.